Thank you for joining me in my first whispered video on the Battle of Yorktown. My future content will be mostly soft-spoken, but on occasion I will be changing things up and doing some whispering, as there are ASMR viewers that really enjoy that. So this particular event in the American Revolution happened at the very end of the war. Obviously there were many key events that happened before this one, so I'm going to give you a brief summary of the events that led to this without giving you a full history of the entire war. As I get ready to do so, I'm going to do some map tracing of the original 13 colonies. Hope you enjoy it. So George Washington, leading the colonial army, spent the first few years of the war barely keeping the army together. The colonials would lose battle after battle and retreat into the countryside. Washington, for a while, didn't seem to win a whole lot. He just seemed to be effective at strategic withdrawals. But there were high marks that kept the colonials going and staying the course. The defeat of the Hessians the day after Christmas at Trenton, after crossing the Delaware, and the Battle of Saratoga were certainly major turning points. But one disadvantage the colonial army had, no matter how things improved on land battles, is that there was no existing colonial navy. The British had that huge naval advantage and could keep choking the colonies from the sea. So as time went by, even with the victories on land, the war turned into a stalemate. But abroad in France, Benjamin Franklin had been wooing the French monarchy into joining the effort against the British. It wasn't a given, though, that France would fight even a sworn enemy like England, because asking a monarch to aid rebels against another monarch went against the very royal establishment and perhaps could lead to class warfare in their own country. And without going into that particular story, there would eventually be elements of revolution in France that would be inspired to do just that. But Franklin had the personality and was successful in getting France to sign on to the alliance. This alliance was key, as now Washington would have a navy at his disposal. So by spring of 1778, France entered the war. Washington's hope was for France to establish naval superiority. That way the British army could be attacked by both land and by sea. But this did not happen as swiftly as Washington had hoped. French Admiral Comte d'Estaing crossed the Atlantic, but did so much slower than expected, and the British fleet was able to maneuver away from Philadelphia before the French could trap them. So instead, the French took their ships to New York City. But the French had concerns that these ships were going to run aground at the mouth of New York Harbor. And the colonial army, for their part, had started having their own setbacks. Benedict Arnold had betrayed Washington, and there were also bad defeats at Charleston and Camden, South Carolina. British General Cornwallis was starting to push into North Carolina. By December of 1780, Benedict Arnold was sent by the British to Virginia, and Washington sent French nobleman Marquis de Lafayette to face Benedict Arnold. Washington then urged the French to send a large fleet of warships to the Chesapeake Bay area to hopefully trap Benedict Arnold. The stage was set for a major battle that would decide the outcome of the Revolutionary War, and that will be our main point of discussion today. So one thing overlooked in the Revolutionary War conflict was the degree to which this became somewhat of a worldwide conflict towards the end of the war. There were naval battles fought other places, such as the English Channel and the Caribbean between Britain and France. One battle was even fought as far away as India. Those battles were underrated in their help in keeping Britain from gaining more strength in North America. Britain's resources would become stretched around the world as a result. Much of Britain's naval resources were concentrated in the Caribbean. This was because of the valuable sugar trade. In addition, Spain, very eager to get decimated the British fleet. It also inflicted great damage on the French and Spanish fleets as well. And then 1 week later, on October 3rd, 1780, another hurricane hit. This one destroyed many harbors across the Caribbean. By the end of that month, a total of 3 major hurricanes had hit the Caribbean. France wanted to avoid these future issues, so there was a bit of an attitude adjustment on where they wanted their fleet to be. This led to them spending more efforts in the continental North American area than the Caribbean. Ultimately, this would push the French into the Chesapeake Bay area, which would lead to their availability for future battles, including the main event that we are discussing. British Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton viewed the control of the Chesapeake Bay area as the most key to victory. Any colonists' communications had to pass between the Chesapeake and the Blue Ridge Mountains. If Clinton could cut off the supply lines, he could starve the South into submission. The person Clinton thought was best suited to lead this effort was none other than the recent turncoat to the British, Benedict Arnold. He believed that Arnold had the skill for the task and would provide an added psychological effect of the colonists facing a former soldier from their own side. But what Clinton didn't count on is that the emotions would swing in the colonists' favor as they were bent on revenge. To further inflame the anger towards him, Arnold marched into Richmond and burned several warehouses. He attempted to capture Thomas Jefferson, who at the time was serving as the governor of Virginia. Jefferson evaded the capture, but it led to more burning and pillaging, including some churches. Although all the efforts that Arnold made were seen as positive by Henry Clinton, even some British officers serving under Arnold did not like serving under someone who was seen as a traitor. Hessian commander Johann Ewald, who fought on the side of the British, said this about Benedict Arnold: if he really felt in his conscience that he had done wrong in siding against his mother country, he should have sheathed his sword and served no more, and then made known in writing his opinions with his reasons. This would have gained more proselytes than his shameful enterprise, which every man of honor and fine feelings, whether he be friend or foe of the common cause, must loathe. This man remained so detestable to me that I had to use every effort not to let him perceive or even feel the indignation of my soul. Johann Ewald. Later, Arnold had his army in Portsmouth, near Norfolk. He had heard rumors of colonial troops wintering in New Jersey that were committing mutiny against their commanding officer, General Anthony Wayne. There was talk of the mutineers marching to Philadelphia to threaten Congress at gunpoint. There was an attempt to turn the mutineers to the British side, but it had the opposite intended effect. The mutineers didn't want to be seen as a bunch of Benedict Arnolds, and instead negotiated a settlement to stay. After this time, on March the 2nd, 1781, Washington visited the French fleet that were anchored at Newport, Rhode Island, with the idea to implore the French fleet to dispatch to Chesapeake Bay to attempt to capture Arnold and give the British a huge blow. Washington was hoping that it would bring a huge morale boost to the colonists' cause, but even though Washington was technically the commander-in-chief of the Allied armies, it would ultimately be the call of the French generals, Comte de Rochambeau and André de Duchesne. Washington had no actual power over their fleets of ships, so he could only make requests. Rochambeau and de Duchesne never even included George Washington in their decision-making at all. Washington and Newport had the annoyance of meetings, troop reviews, and fancy balls in Newport, and it was unclear at this point that he would get what he wanted. It would be another 6 days before the French honored Washington's request to leave for Chesapeake. The British, for their part, had heard that the French fleet was headed to Chesapeake, but they were dealing with ships damaged from previous storms, so they hurried to get their ships ready to intercept the French at Chesapeake. But it was not until March 10th that the British left Long Island, New York. But the French hit some setbacks. They hit a very dense fog, and the ships became separated. This delay caused the British and French ships to be on a collision course horse for a battle. The battle the French and British ships fought on March 16, 1781 became known as the Battle of Cape Henry. It was an intense sea battle, with the French suffering more casualties but less overall fleet damage than the British, whose ships had been decimated. The British felt disgraced by this loss, as in the past the British had been viewed as a more superior navy. One of Washington's commanders, the Marquis de Lafayette, had begun to close in on Arnold with the news that the French had won the Battle of Cape Henry, but later it was learned that the French did not sail into Chesapeake to support the attack against Arnold. In spite of winning the battle, French General de Touchet decided that he would sail to Newport. Apparently, he did not realize the blow that he had struck to the British, and he had gone into Chesapeake at that point. He could have easily destroyed them and helped Lafayette defeat Arnold. Instead, the British sailed into Chesapeake, battered and still in sad shape, nonetheless able to shore up Benedict Arnold and essentially establish control of Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, British General Cornwallis was in the North Carolina interior in pursuit of Daniel Morgan's colonial troops. Cornwallis was trying to rapidly move across the Carolinas in hopes of cutting the southern contingent of rebels, but he was finding that due to wagons loaded down with food and supplies, they weren't moving fast enough. At this point, Cornwallis made a fateful decision to burn their supply wagons, essentially depriving thousands of soldiers of food, shelter, and rum. They were left to live off the land and sleep outdoors, and they were to be sober by default. Knowing that Cornwallis had stepped up his pursuit of Morgan, Nathaniel Greene, who had another piece of the Continental Army in the eastern part of North Carolina, met with Morgan in Salisbury, North Carolina, about 50 miles from there. Since Greene had left his army behind and was just there to discuss strategy, this was very risky because the British were nearby and could have captured Greene. In fact, the British army and Cornwallis was on the other side of the Catawba River from Greene and Morgan. The British spotted them from the other side, but could not attack because the river had risen to a level to make it uncrossable. This saved Morgan's army because they were grossly outnumbered by Cornwallis. Greene decided to bring his army to Salisbury with the hopes of Morgan holding off Cornwallis until they could combine armies. So while they were waiting for Greene's army to arrive, Morgan's men were anticipating Cornwallis to make his crossing of the Catawba River. This was a treacherous crossing for Cornwallis. In fact, Cornwallis lost his horse in the crossing, who was shot at and drowned. The crossing was overall successful for Cornwallis, though, who could now focus on chasing Morgan and Greene. But the colonial army had scattered all along the roads. There were civilians who had loaded up their wagons to flee their homes. The British destroyed anything and everything in their path and had committed to total war on anything and everything that had the misfortune to cross them. Morgan and Greene, still waiting on Greene's army to rendezvous by this time, were near Salisbury, North Carolina. The concern was that Cornwallis would get to Salisbury before the main contingent of the colonial army got there, so they sent word to the main army to meet Morgan and Greene at a town near modern-day Greensboro, North Carolina, which is Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis was still in hot pursuit, but before he could get Morgan, the army had crossed the Yadkin River, which was enough of a barrier to slow Cornwallis down. The colonial army, now together, numbered at about 2,000. But would it be big enough? Greene determined the answer to that was in the negative, so he determined his best option was to head north into Virginia. There he could get additional reinforcements and equipment from Governor Thomas Jefferson. Greene came up with an ingenious plan. He would send a cavalry in one direction as a decoy to convince Cornwallis that was the main point of the army. The main army would then head east in hopes of crossing the treacherous Dan River safely away from Cornwallis. The plan was working. By the time Cornwallis figured out what was happening, he was far from Greene, about 30 miles, with the colonial cavalry in between. But Cornwallis, being without wagons and his troops Cornwallis decided to stay in North Carolina and lick his wounds rather than following an army by this time outnumbering his. So Greene, now with greater numbers, decided to go back into North Carolina to now chase Cornwallis. Greene had essentially doubled his numbers with reinforcements. Greene ultimately met Cornwallis and the British at Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781, in a battle described by its participants as very bloody and long. Cornwallis's British regulars had been dealt a major blow and retreated to Wilmington, North Carolina, in order to wait for reinforcements that were supposed to come from South Carolina. In the meantime, Greene headed into South Carolina and attacked British fortified positions and forced them to retreat to Charleston, which denied Cornwallis some reinforcements. But Greene's army was so battered that he could not finish Cornwallis off completely. Cornwallis decided he needed to leave Wilmington and head north before Greene regained strength. So on April 25th, Cornwallis marched north to Virginia. His destination was Petersburg, Virginia, where he had hoped to meet up with British Major General William Phillips. On the colonial side, Marquis de Lafayette was in Virginia with just 900 troops, since the bulk of the colonial army was still in the Carolinas, with many more troops north of there in Pennsylvania and New York. Rochambeau, the French naval general, had secretly had France send 26 ships to the West Indies, reason being he wanted them at a safe distance from the British fleet, but close enough to be called upon if needed to evacuate the French troops. Apparently, Rochambeau had very little faith that the colonials could win this war. Washington had caught wind of this, but didn't want to endanger the already delicate alliance with France. Washington's ultimate endgame he wanted with the French was to attack New York. The French did not like this arrangement, and there was a lot of back and forth arguments between Rochambeau and Washington. Eventually, Washington had a card he could play. It was a newspaper article that detailed the French ships that were holding in West Indies. Rochambeau forwarded the article to Washington, who then suggested that the ships go to New York for a joint attack on the bulk of the British forces under Henry Clinton. But Rochambeau had other plans. He suggested the ships be sent to the Chesapeake. Washington did not like this plan, as he was concerned about the bulk of his army not being able to be transported to Virginia easily. But unfortunately, Washington found himself in a position where once again he was commander-in-chief in name only. Cornwallis arrived in Petersburg, and with the present army there and some reinforcements that arrived, Cornwallis now had 7,000 troops. Cornwallis campaigned across Virginia for weeks, burning and looting the countryside. At this point, you had the bulk of the Continental Army in New York under Washington, hoping to link forces with the French, and hoping the ships in the Caribbean would come through to help with the joint assault, whether it be in New York or the Chesapeake Bay. In the Caribbean, the Spanish had joined the French in different skirmishes with the British. The Spanish had seized control of Pensacola, and because the French had aided them, Spanish Captain Francisco Saavedra was ready to reciprocate and help the French as well. Cornwallis, under orders from Henry Clinton, made his way to Yorktown as he was told to build a naval base there. The French ships stationed in the Caribbean made the decision to head for the Chesapeake Bay as the hurricane season approached, as this was Rochambeau's previously discussed intention for them. Washington, by July of 1781, had all but decided anyway to abandon his idea of attacking New York, and had considered the merits of a southern strategy in Virginia. But the challenge was logistics. Trying to move his men from New York to Virginia would be a challenge. But Washington had received word of Cornwallis establishing the base at Yorktown. He was pleased to hear this, as he was very Chesapeake, get the 5,000 Rochambeau had in Newport, and hope that the 3,100 soldiers from the Caribbean would also get there. There was a lot riding on a few things going right. The French had only agreed to stay in Virginia until October 15th, essentially putting Washington on the clock. He had to get his men to Virginia in 2 months and hoped that Cornwallis stayed there. Washington decided to leave half his army in West Point, New York, in hopes if the British attacked them, the fortifications would be enough to hold the British off. The 2,500 men Washington marched south with included Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Lincoln. The key to their success was keeping the plan away from Henry Clinton and the British, who would most certainly attack West Point once he realized that the bulk of the force was gone. Washington accomplished this by planning correspondence to be intercepted by British spies that indicated an imminent attack on New York City. Washington hurriedly tried to move through New Jersey, but would turn south when it became apparent that Clinton wasn't going to pursue them and was too far away to do so. Meanwhile, Clinton had dispatched ships to Massachusetts looking for the French fleet, who by this time had already headed to Chesapeake. So not only had Washington brought his troops south under Clinton's nose, the naval engagements that could have happened never did, and Clinton sat tight in New York waiting for a siege that would never come. A few days later, Clinton learned that the French were gone from Newport, but Clinton still believed that they could be coming to New York, so he refused to send ships to Chesapeake. This was a gross miscalculation. By the end of August, it was apparent to the British that Washington's army was headed to Virginia. At this point, there was little that Clinton could do other than hope that Cornwallis could hold on to Yorktown. By now, the French fleet had made it to Chesapeake. In fact, the French fleet had already dropped anchor and began preparations for attack, but they were advised to wait for Washington and other French reinforcements. In the meantime, French ships were moving troops to combine as many of the forces as possible. In addition, ships stayed around the mouth of the York River to prevent Cornwallis from making a water escape. The British fleet, with about 19 ships and led by Admiral Thomas Graves, arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and discovered not only were the French already there, the British were outnumbered by several ships. The French noticed this and immediately went to intercept the British fleet. The French contingent was led by Admiral Degrassi. The British had somewhat of an advantage in that their ships were closer together and some of the French ships were miles away, but nature lended a hand by sending some heavy winds. These winds blew the British back away from the bay, but the French continued pursuing them, trying to ensure that the British never entered the bay. For days, the battle, known as the Battle of the Chesapeake, raged on. Heavy damage was inflicted on the British squadron. One of the ships had been destroyed completely. The French made a tactical decision to head into the Chesapeake Bay, where by now additional French ships had arrived. Once the British realized they were even more outnumbered, the British decided to retreat to New York in hopes that they would be able to get more reinforcements. The next night, on September 14th, Washington and General Rochambeau from France rode into Williamsburg. Once in Williamsburg, Washington learned of Degrassi's victory over the British. He was thrilled, but the joy was short-lived, as Washington learned that Degrassi wanted to leave the Allied effort behind. So Washington and Rochambeau sailed downriver in hopes of asking Degrassi to stay in the Chesapeake Bay. Washington was successful at convincing Degrassi to stay until the end of October. This would ensure that Washington had the needed sea power. Cornwallis, while hearing of the defeat of the British ships, tried to stay optimistic. He had heard that additional ships would be coming, but once he learned that French ships in Chesapeake now numbered 36, his countenance changed, and he sent a dispatch to Henry Clinton saying, "This place is in no state of defense. If you cannot relieve me very soon, you must be prepared to hear the worst." So by now, the soldiers of the Americans and French surrounded Yorktown, close to 40,000 men to Cornwallis's 9,000 men. This made Yorktown the largest populated city in America, at least for a few weeks, while the essentially, the York River surrounded the British on three sides, and the line prevented escape. The British had nowhere to go. This was an arduous task for the colonials, as the British barraged them as they were building the parallels. But this finally paid off in October when the parallels were complete. Then the batteries with the cannons were put into place, and Washington had the honor of firing the first cannon. The cannonball went directly into a house that was hosting a dinner for Cornwallis, killing the British Commissary General who was present at the Cornwallis dinner. The barrage continued for many days. Cornwallis kept imploring the British to stay the course and was promising relief in the form of more ships and soldiers, hopefully from Henry Clinton in New York. Alexander Hamilton persuaded Washington to let him and Marquis de Lafayette storm the British fortifications with their armies. So Hamilton and Lafayette stormed the fortifications, and the French did the same for two other fortifications. This was a bold move, but these fortifications were able to then be incorporated into the existing parallels. In New York, the damaged British ships from the Battle of Chesapeake were being repaired in hopes of returning to help Cornwallis. By this time, Cornwallis decided to plan his escape. He really only had one option: to cross the York River, where waiting for him were less American troops, but troops not expecting an ambush, and then Cornwallis would be able to fight his way out, hoping to head to New York. It was a bold move for sure, so Cornwallis attempted his escape across the York River. As they made their way across in 16 rowboats, the wind started to blow and heavy rain began capsizing several boats and sending some boats downriver. Cornwallis was forced to abandon the plan, and the troops returned to Yorktown. Then on October 17th, 1781, Cornwallis decided to surrender for lack of any other options. The siege at Yorktown had ended. On October 19, 1871, the Articles of Capitulation were signed. This was no formal end to the war at all. It would lead to debate in Parliament on whether the war would be worth fighting, though. Up north, the British fleet had departed. They were intercepted by a small boat with 3 men who escaped Yorktown to avoid capture. They told them that the Cornwallis had surrendered. The British decided upon hearing this to just return to New York. British General O'Hara, in place of Cornwallis, who claimed to be sick, marched out to deliver his sword as to be the formal surrender. O'Hara saw Washington, but instead, in a last act of defiance, tried to deliver his sword to French General Rochambeau, who refused it and told him to give it to Washington. Washington referred O'Hara to his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, who accepted the surrender sword. On November 25, 1781, word of the defeat reached London. King George III had indicated that he wanted to continue the fight, but he soon had to come to realize that he didn't have much choice. The English people were tired of the war. Henry Clinton was removed as British Commander-in-Chief, and the Royal Army was to be removed from America altogether. Formal negotiations for peace had begun in Paris, and the war was finally over. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.